Okay, so freedom of speech, that's a hot topic, and it seems like it's been even more so recently, and you've sent us a ton of stuff
Yeah.
about executive orders, discussions people are having online, and like even college classes talking about this.
There
We've got transcripts from YouTube, we've got reports, all sorts of things.
are a lot of different angles on this.
Yeah, so let's just dive right in and, try to extract, like, what are the main points? What are the main arguments that people are making?
That's good.
So to start with, I mean, there's this executive order, right? Restoring freedom of speech and ending federal censorship. Pretty straightforward title there.
Yeah, no messing around.
No messing around. It was signed on January 20th, 2025. And like right off the bat, it's talking about how the previous administration, the Biden administration was doing some things that a lot of people were concerned about when it came to, online speech and specifically social media.
Yeah, and, a lot of what we're seeing in these sources are saying that the government was really putting pressure on those social media companies.
For moderate content.
Yeah, exactly. And even in some cases, it seems like they were trying to get them to completely remove certain content altogether.
And they were saying that this was all to combat, this and misinformation, which obviously sounds good on the surface.
Right. Who wants misinformation out there?
Exactly. But it kind of gets into this murky area of like, who gets to decide what is misinformation and what isn't?
Yeah, that's the big question, right?
Yeah.
And some of the sources we've got really highlight this, like that transcript from the AVM Employers Association. They actually quote the Trump administration saying that the Biden administration was trampling free speech rights by censoring America's speech on online platforms.
Mm-hmm.
So you can see right there how charged this whole topic is.
Absolutely. So, this executive order is clearly trying to address this, but what does it actually like lay out? What are the specifics?
Okay, so one of the first things is a really strong statement about the First Amendment.
Yeah, making it very clear that's like the foundation of this whole thing.
Totally. And they're basically saying that the government can't mess with free speech. Like, that's just not allowed.
And there's this whole thing about taxpayer dollars, right? Like how they can and cannot be used.
Yeah, that's a big one. So the order specifically says that the government can't use taxpayer money to do anything that they're calling unconstitutional censorship.
Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. But there's also this part where the executive order is like looking back at the past, right?
Yeah, it's not just about moving forward. It's about trying to figure out what happened before.
Yeah.
So they're asking the attorney general
Investigate.
exactly to investigate what the government was doing over the 4 years before this executive order. Were they censoring people? Were they going too far?
Wow, so the attorney general has to like go back and try to find out what was going on.
Yeah, it's a big task. And it's really interesting because how do you prove that kind of thing? Like, what were people's intentions? How do you even access all those communications and decisions from years ago?
It's like a whole can of worms.
It really is.
But it shows that they're serious about this, right? Like they want to get to the bottom of it.
Absolutely.
So besides that, what else does this executive order actually like forbid people from doing?
Well, it says straight up that federal departments and agencies and all the people who work for them can't use any of their resources to violate anyone's free speech rights.
So no more, sneaky ways of trying to silence people.
That's the idea anyway.
Okay, so that's a big one. But there are some like limits to this, right?
Yeah, there are some important caveats in there.
Mm-hmm.
So they say that anything they do under this executive order has to follow existing laws, and they also can't go over budget.
Right. Makes sense.
And here's a really important part. It says that this executive order doesn't give anyone new grounds to sue the government.
Oh, so it's not like people can suddenly start suing over things that happened in the past.
That's right. They're trying to set some boundaries there.
Okay, so that's like the executive order itself, but we've got all these other perspectives, right? Like people reacting to it, analyzing it, debating it.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of different opinions out there, and it's pretty divided.
Like, what are some of the strongest reactions you saw?
Well, one that really sticks out is from that Strat News Global video. They are very much in favor of this executive order.
Like they think it's a good thing.
Oh, yeah. They're calling it a necessary step to get rid of what they call a censorship cartel.
A censorship cartel. Strong words.
Yeah, they're basically saying that the government and other organizations have been working together to silence people, and they want to put a stop to it.
Okay, so they're all about free speech no matter what.
Pretty much. And they specifically talk about wanting to stop the government from funding any efforts to label speech as mis or disinformation.
And they even talk about like finding and firing federal employees who were involved in censorship.
Yeah, they're not messing around.
So that's like one side of the spectrum. But then you've got sources like that Top Now TV transcript, and they're a little more hesitant.
Yeah, they're definitely more cautious.
Yeah.
They're saying that this executive order might actually make things Worse.
What?
Well, they're worried that by getting rid of any efforts to moderate content online, you might just end up with more polarization and more misinformation spreading.
Because people can say whatever they want without any consequences.
Exactly. And they're saying that it's really hard to find that balance between protecting free speech and making sure that people are being responsible.
Right. So it's not as simple as just saying everyone can say anything they want.
No, it's a really complex issue.
And it's not just about the government, right? Like we're talking about these huge social media platforms.
Oh, yeah, they have a ton of power in this whole thing, too.
So we've got these strong opinions on both sides, but then there are also these reports that try to be a little more neutral, right?
Yeah, they're looking at it from a more analytical perspective, like that SWOT analysis.
SWOT, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities,
Yeah,
threats.
exactly. So they're trying to weigh the pros and cons.
And what are they saying?
Well, they say that the executive order is good in some ways. Like, it does align with the principles of free speech, and it tries to be more transparent about what the government's doing.
Okay, so that's a plus.
Yeah, but they also point out some potential problems, like how do you actually implement this in a practical way?
Yeah. How do you make sure it's actually being followed?
Right, and they also say that some people might see this as a step backwards in the fight against misinformation.
Like it's giving up on trying to control it?
Kind of. And they also say that there could be a lot of legal challenges to this executive order.
Like people suing over how it's being interpreted.
Exactly. So even though it's trying to prevent lawsuits, it might actually end up causing more.
It's
It
complicated.
really is.
Okay, so let's move on to something a little different. We've got this transcript from a college class, SOC 119,
Yeah, this one's really interesting. It gives us a totally different perspective.
because it's like real people talking about this, right? Not just politicians and analysts.
Exactly. And they're talking about it in the context of this promised presidential action to restore freedom of speech and ending federal censorship.
So right away, they're connecting it back to the executive order.
Yeah. Yeah. And what I thought was really interesting is that the professor starts by talking about how he's seen more and more self-censorship in his classroom.
Like students are afraid to speak their minds.
Yeah, he's saying that there's this feeling that there are all these unspoken rules about what you can and can't say.
And he's specifically saying that a lot of this pressure is coming from the left.
Yeah, it's not always the group you might expect.
So it's like this fear of being canceled or something.
It seems like it, and it kind of mirrors what's happening online with the whole censorship debate.
Like it's not just about the government, it's about this broader culture of being afraid to say the wrong thing.
Exactly.
And then they get into this whole thing about words being scrubbed from government websites and documents.
Yeah, this is where it gets really strange.
Like, what kind of words are we talking about?
So it's not that these words are banned or anything, but the professor is saying that if you use them, it might raise some red flags.
Especially if you're, like, applying for a grant or something.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like they might look at you funny.
Yeah. Okay, so what are some examples?
Well, there are a lot of words related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, like BIPOC, Black, Latinx, things like that.
Okay, so kind of sensitive topics.
Yeah, but it's not just that. There are also words like climate change, vaccines,
Measles.
yeah, measles, H5N1, bird flu.
Really specific.
Yeah, and even broader terms like social justice, ideology, prejudice.
Wow, so it's like this huge range of words.
And the professor is saying that researchers might avoid using these words in their grant proposals just to be safe.
Because they don't want to get rejected or something.
Exactly. So it's like this subtle form of censorship.
Where they're not saying you can't use these words, but they're making it clear that they don't like them.
Yeah, it's definitely a way of influencing what people say without explicitly banning anything.
It's interesting. And then they have this whole classroom activity where they divide the students into team freedom and team censorship.
Yeah, and they put all the international students on team censorship.
And these students are from like China, Saudi Arabia, Iran.
Yeah, countries with very different ideas about free speech.
And how did that go?
It was really interesting to hear their perspectives.
Like, what were they saying?
Well, the student from China was talking about how surveillance is necessary to catch criminals.
So, like, it's okay to limit freedom if it means keeping people safe?
That was their argument, and the student from Saudi Arabia was basically saying that free speech is overrated.
Wow.
Yeah, they were saying that it just leads to chaos and instability.
And what about the student from Iran?
They were really cautious about criticizing their own government.
Understandably.
Yeah, and they were talking about how you have to be careful about what you say because there can be serious consequences.
So you can see how their experiences in those countries have really shaped their views on free speech.
Absolutely, and it really makes you think about how different cultures have such different ideas about what's acceptable and what's not.
Like, is there even such a thing as universal free
A
speech?
big question.
Yeah, and then they go on to talk about all these other big issues, right? Like proof of citizenship for voting deportations, even birthright citizenship.
Yeah, it was a very wide-ranging discussion.
And they talked about how all these things are kind of interconnected.
Right, like you can't talk about free speech without talking about immigration and voting rights and all these other things.
And the professor used this analogy about changing your jacket and stepping onto a different square to try to understand someone else's perspective.
Yeah, that was a good one. It's basically saying that you have to try to see things from someone else's point of view, even if you disagree with them.
Which is hard but important.
Definitely.
Okay, so let's move on to the media. Now we've got some sources that are talking about bias and censorship in the media.
Yeah, there are some concerns about certain outlets like NPR and PBS.
Like they're supposed to be unbiased, but some people are saying that they're not.
Yeah, and they're pointing to specific examples like the way they covered the Hunter Biden laptop story.
Versus how they covered the Russia collusion allegations.
Exactly. And they're saying that NPR and PBS didn't give those stories equal treatment.
And they also talk about how those outlets use the term far right a lot more than far left.
Which suggests that they might have a certain bias.
Yeah, and this all feeds into this idea that there's a growing movement against free speech.
And it's not just the government. It's universities, corporations, all sorts of institutions.
It's like they're all trying to control what people can say.
And some people are even saying that there's a whole industry of disinformation experts who are being paid to silence certain viewpoints.
Wow, so it's like a conspiracy theory almost.
It can sound like that, but they do bring up some examples like the Twitter files and the Facebook files.
Which were those internal documents that were leaked, right?
Yeah, and they showed how government officials were trying to influence what content was allowed on those platforms.
So it's not just a theory, it's actually happening.
To some extent, yeah. And they also talk about how the Biden administration was really focused on combating misinformation, disinformation, and even malinformation.
And malinformation is like using factual information to mislead people?
Yeah, it's a tricky one because it gets into the whole question of intent. Like, are you deliberately trying to mislead people, or are you just presenting the information in a way that supports your own argument?
It's hard to say sometimes.
It really is. And then there's a whole international angle, too.
Like with the EU's Digital Services Act.
Yeah, that's a big one because it could potentially force American companies to censor content, even for users who are outside of the EU.
So American citizens could be subject to EU censorship laws even if they're not in the EU.
Exactly. It's a really complicated issue with global implications.
It shows how interconnected everything is these days.
Definitely.
Okay, and then we've got this crash course video that kind of brings us back to the basics of free speech in America.
Yeah, it's a good reminder of the fundamentals.
So what are they saying?
Well, they emphasize that the whole point of the First Amendment is to allow people to criticize the government without being punished.
Like that's the core principle.
Absolutely. And they also make a really important distinction between government censorship and censorship by private entities.
Like social media companies.
Exactly. So the First Amendment only protects you from the government censoring you. It doesn't apply to private companies.
Which is an important thing to remember.
Definitely. And they also talk about how different types of speech have different levels of protection.
Like political speech is the most protected.
Right. And they remind us of the imminent lawless action standard from Brandenburg v. Ohio.
Which basically says that you can't be punished for speech unless it's directly inciting violence.
Yeah, it's a pretty high bar.
So it seems like there's a lot to think about here.
Yeah, it's a really complex issue with a lot of different angles.
And it's not just about free speech. It's about the government, social media companies, individual rights, all sorts of things.
It's all interconnected.
So what do you think are the biggest challenges moving forward?
One of the biggest challenges is finding that balance between protecting free speech and preventing the spread of harmful misinformation.
Right. How do you do both?
Exactly. And then there's the whole question of who gets to decide what is misinformation and what isn't.
That's a big one.
Yeah. And then there's the global aspect of this. Like, how do different countries with different laws and values deal with online speech?
It's a mess.
It's a big mess, but it's an important one.
Absolutely, because it affects all of us.
Yeah. And it's something we all need to be thinking about and talking about.
So I guess the question for you listening is, what do you think? What role should the government play in online speech? What about social media companies? And what about individuals like you? What can you do to make sure that your voice is heard while also respecting the rights of others?
It's a big question, but it's one that we all need to be asking ourselves.
So thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of free speech and censorship. It's a complex issue, but hopefully we've given you some food for thought.
Yeah. Keep thinking about it. Keep talking about it. It's an important conversation to have.
Absolutely.